turning and turning. In the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when some vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. Darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I happened to have a most enlightening talk recently with a man about the Nazis and how they came to power. He said that this so-called German Revolution is really based on simple blackmail. This is his story. Old President Hindenburg had always been a poor man. He decided near the end to change that situation, and he had his son, Oscar von Hindenburg, take over his business affairs. Oscar then speculated on the stock exchange, and when the crash came, suddenly owed 1.3 million marks. To make this back, Oscar then allowed himself to get involved in the Eastern Relief manipulations, the Osthilfe. I don't think his father knew, but the Nazis found out in 1932. The Hitlerites got photostats of the incriminating documents, and from then on had the whip hand. So it seems that we owe the unutterable misery into which we have come to simple blackmail and a financial lapse by Paul von Hindenburg. I happened to be in Munich recently, just as one of the official festivals, which are by now an everyday occurrence, was being celebrated to the blare of tubas and the rat-tat of drums. I could not get a room at my usual hotel, so I found a place to sleep in the old city opposite a school in which a visiting Hitler Youth troupe had been lodged for the holiday period. I saw one of these boys. He'd just thrown off his knapsack. Look about him at the empty classroom. I observed how his glance fell on the crucifix hanging behind the teacher's desk. How in an instant this young, still soft face contorted in fury, how he ripped this symbol to which the cathedrals of Germany and the ringing progressions of the St. Matthew Passion are consecrated off the wall and threw it out the window into the streets with the cry, "Lie there, you dirty Jew, I've seen this." Among people I know, I've heard of more than one case of children denouncing their parents politically and thereby delivering them to the axe. My life in this pit is now entering its 5th year. For more than 42 months I've thought, hate, lain down with hate in my heart. Dreamt hate and awakened with hate. I suffocate in the knowledge that I am the prisoner of a horde of vicious apes, and I rack my brains over the perpetual riddle of how this same people can have sunk into this stupor and isn't capable any longer of perceiving its shame for the shame that it is. I saw Hitler last in Saarbrück. slowly gliding by in a car with armor-plated sides while an armed bodyguard rode in front as further protection. A jelly-like slag, a grey face, a moon face into which two melancholy jet-black eyes had been set like raisins. Today I hear that Hitler recently ended a report by Wilhelm Keitel, the army commander, which had given him reason for dissatisfaction by throwing a bronze vase at the head of the general. Isn't this the kind of thing that happens when a whole people is sinking into the cesspool of its own disgrace? I'm no mystic. I am a child of my time despite all foreboding, and I hold strictly to what I see. And what I saw, gliding by there like the Prince of Darkness himself, was no human being. I've met him a few times. First time, 1920, at the home of my friend Clemens von Frankenstein, who was then director of the Munich State Opera. According to the butler, one of those present was forcing his way in everywhere. It was Hitler. He managed an invitation to Clay's house under the guise of being interested in operatic scene design. He very likely had the idea that theatrical design was connected to his interior decorating and wallpaper hanging, his former profession. He'd come to the house where he'd never been before, dressed in gaiters, a floppy, wide-brimmed hat, carrying a riding whip. There's a collie, too. The effect among the Gobelin tapestries and cool marble walls was something akin to a cowboy, sitting down on the steps of a Baroque altar in leather breeches and spurs with a Colt revolver at his side. Eventually he managed to launch himself into speech. He talked on and on, endlessly. He preached. He went on at us like a division chaplain in the army. We didn't venture to contradict or differ in any way, but he began to bellow at us as the servants thought of being attacked and rushed in to defend us. Oh. When he'd gone, we sat quietly confused. There was a feeling of dismay, as when on a train you suddenly find that you're sharing a compartment with a psychotic. We sat a long time and no one spoke until finally Clay stood up and opened one of the huge windows to let in the spring air, the fresh air. It did help to dispel the feeling of oppression. It wasn't that an unclean body had been in the room, but something else, the unclean essence of monstrosity. I used to ride at the Munich Armory, after which I liked to eat at the Lohmbruck Keller. That was the second meeting. At first glance, the tightly clenched insecurity seemed to be gone, which allowed him to launch at once into one of his tirades. I had ridden hard and was tremendously hungry, wanted just to be left alone to eat in peace. And I had poured out over me every one of the political platitudes in his book, that Machiavellianism by which German foreign policy became a series of legalized burglaries and the activity of its leaders a succession of embezzlements and forgeries and treaty breaches. With his oily hair falling into his face while he ranted, he had the look of a man trying to seduce the cook. Absolutely nothing has happened in the 20 years since I first saw him to make me change my first view of him. The fact remains he basically hates himself, and that his opportunism, his immeasurable need for recognition, and his now apocalyptic vanity are all based on one thing, a consuming drive to drown out the pain in his psyche. The trauma of a monstrosity. There he sat. A raw vegetable Genghis Khan, a womanless Napoleon, a teetotaling Alexander, an effigy of Bismarck, who would very likely have had to go to bed for 4 weeks if he tried to eat just one of Bismarck's breakfasts. I'd driven into town, and since at that time, September 1932, the streets were already quite unsafe. I had a loaded revolver with me in that almost deserted restaurant. I could have shot him. If I had had any inkling of the role this piece of filth was to play, of the years of suffering he was to make us endure, I would have done it without a second thought. But I took him for a character in a comic strip, and I didn't shoot. It would have made no difference anyway. Our martyrdom had already been decided. If Hitler, at that point, had been tied to the railway tracks, the train would have been derailed before it got to him. When his hour strikes, the end will come down upon his head from every possible direction. There are many rumors of attempts to assassinate him. The attempts fail. They will continue to fail. For years it has seemed that God is asleep. I'm writing this in a Berlin hotel, which is about as quiet and discreet as a howitzer. Pondering the great changes of the 19th century, I realized at the moment 70 years ago when Germany, in its infatuation with prosperity, agreed to let Prussia be its advisor and its procurer, it went to the dogs. Prussia is a state patched together out of bits and pieces. It was never meant to be a nation. To hold together the monstrous structure, the Prussians had to put all their energies into their military machine, as a result of which no middle class and no true cult of the learned could ever come into being. Here, then, is where the preference for the provisional and the second rate was born. The disposition towards ersatz can be seen in the Baroque trappings of the kings of Prussia, the gilded plaster of their palaces, accompanied by the demand, backed up by the gun, to please, if you will, be so good as to take all this as solid and definitive and valid. This, then, is where the eternal more originated, the deification of the threadbare, the cult of the ugly. This is the place where the eye-bulging hatred against everybody who had more, the ceaseless eyeing of other people's prosperity originated, the readiness to sudden banditry, and the drive to make this Prussian cult of the threadbare into the state religion of Germany. And they will, if other people prove recalcitrant, to use the guns. And here I touch on the central political problem facing Europe today. After the Prussian oligarchy, which was at least aware that it had responsibilities, disappeared, the men of Versailles were guilty of the incredible stupidity of dismembering Austria. After that, all that was needed was for Prussian greed to combine with the political condottieri, and the end, which all of us knew was in the making, the catastrophe was upon us. It may be a German problem today, but tomorrow it will be an issue for Europe and the world to resolve. The day is fast approaching when Europe will have to decide whether it will let itself be engulfed or will finally defend its own heart from the Prussian drive for power. My friends have taken the occasion to give me warning about my writings. Driven as I am by my own inner necessity, I must ignore these warnings and continue with these notes. Night after night, I hide this record deep in the woods on my land, constantly on the lookout lest I'm observed, constantly changing my hiding place, and that is how we live. My vanished friends, Do you, who left Germany 4 or more years ago, have any idea how completely without legal status we are of what it is to be threatened with denunciation at any time? Will you actually be able to understand that flight was more comfortable than remaining at the dangerous outpost, an illegal watcher among the barbarians? Will you actually be able to grasp what it is meant to spend these long years with a heart filled with hate? Hate at lying down, hate at rising, hate through long hours of bad dreams. Whilst through it all, the stigma of illegality sits on one's brow. Do you think we'll speak the same language when this is over? Will you grasp that the death-like loneliness of our lives and the misery-laden air of the catacombs we have been breathing for so long have made these eyes incredibly clear-sighted? May it not be that within the moments of your return, that the visions that these eyes can see in the distance will frighten you? We live in a gigantic spiritual vacuum. What are the words that... The end of the world is at hand, that Dostoevsky wrote 70 years ago, but an intimation of how the apocalyptic horsemen now thundering down upon us, the prophecy of how utterly lost we have become. Truly, Dostoevsky's right. The end of the world is at hand. Now Austria, the Anschluss. We have seen it coming for weeks. Certainly we knew what it all meant. The threats, the staged riots, the whole shabby performance designed to provide a reason for intervention, and now tank and artillery columns are rolling down every street as though the enemy were a European great power and not a tiny nation of 7 million inhabitants. I see in this general brutality, this nasty satisfaction at the fate of the Austrian leaders, this generalized delight in ridicule and rape, something ignoble which makes me deeply ashamed. Austria, poor, eternally derided Austria, whose only sin was that until the end, and in the face of the attack by Greater Prussia, it held to one last recollection of the noble old Holy Roman Empire. In Salzburg, where I have been staying these past few days, these Berlin potato faces fill the streets together with their full-bosomed females. Thanks to the rate of exchange, they can make off with everything for a song, including goods that are no longer available in Germany, and now the shelves are empty. Why in the world did Schuschnigg, the Austrian Chancellor, not give the order to shoot in one last attempt to awaken the world from its incomprehensible lethargy? I foresee the day when the nations will regret their cowardly passivity. The cost will be beyond measuring, but they will have to pay it someday. In this first great breach of the peace, the criminal has been let go unpunished, and we, who were his only opponents inside Germany, are made weaker and more impotent. And what did everyone do? They stood around and they watched, thus making impossible any resistance inside Germany. And what are they doing today? They are standing around there watching, preoccupied with figuring out a way to avoid irritating Herr Hitler. As I write, an immense flight of bombers is droning past overhead. For the past hour, the drone has gone on above, as though those planes are flying against a world power. I will hate and curse you from my grave. And it will be your children and your children's children who will have to bear my curse. I have no weapon against you but this curse. And I know that it withers the heart of him who utters it. I do not know if I will survive your downfall, but this I do know, that any man must hate this Germany with all his heart if he truly loves it. I'm a German. I'm a German. I'm a German. Now encircle this land in which I live with all my love. Never again can I be torn from here without going to seed. I tremble for each tree and wood that disappears, for each silent valley that is devastated, for each stream that these pirates of industry, the real masters of our land, threaten. September 1938, Munich and the Czech crisis. Do I, believe that this regime is a legitimate government? I have, since January the 30th, 1933, never ceased to view it as criminal. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht. I rack my brains to discover the meaning of this persecution of the Jews which Goebbels has instigated. At a time when the regime still needed peace, surely this must call forth the deadly enmity of the whole world and to make war inevitable. Surely this must call forth the deadly enmity of the whole world and make war inevitable. Max Moore's dead. The light goes out and then another, and eventually the theatre's dark, and the stage where all was light and animation only a short time before is empty. Every now and then an icy wind sweeps out of the dark room behind onto the stage. To go on living now, it needs a constant summoning up of one's will. For years now, to go on living has been to go on hating and let no one fool himself about the nature of such hatred. It is the father of action. The way out of our defiled and desecrated house is through the command to hate Satan. Only thus will we earn the right to search in the darkness for the way of love. August 1939, the signing of the Germano-Russo Non-Aggression Pact. November 1939, fall of France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway. Every nation seems to bury its demons, its delusions, its impossible dreams away into the vaults and cellars and underground prisons of its unconscious. Germany has reversed the process. Let them loose. The contents have escaped like the winds out of Pandora's box, and a storm is raging across this long-suffering old earth, and Germany, drunk with victory, is sick. People sell stolen paintings and sculptures and wine cellars. They deal in securities and silk stockings and ownerless French factories with stolen machines, with rubber goods, with toilet soap, with soup spoons. In Berlin, absolutely everybody deals. This is Germany today. Industry pulls all the strings. The instrument of power is terror, and industry holds tight to it. They control all the means of influencing public opinion and have thereby stupefied the mass to the point of idiocy. It should be observed that my own viewpoint is that of a conservative, and further observed that between this viewpoint and that of the nationalists is a chasm as wide as a fucking canyon. To be a conservative means to be a believer in the immutable laws of this old earth that will shake and quake when the day finally comes for it to cleanse itself of all this filth. But I'm supposed to deify this Reich. I'm supposed to approve of deception and murder and treaty breaking. I'm supposed to join in the shrieks, the jubilant shouts when the enemy falls like a torch from his exploding aeroplane. In a Berlin cinema recently, I saw the newsreel in which Hitler, standing in front of the historic railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, receives the news of the capitulation of France and begins to dance on one foot. I have never been so ashamed of my countrymen as I was there in that cinema, surrounded by the clamour of a mob in ecstasy at the sight of its hopping furor. I got up and I left. I was supposed to do that hopping filth, the honour of applauding it. If I'd given any clearer expression of what I was really thinking, I'd very likely have been lynched. What price a forest if the national interest calls for a factory? A German cathedral that stands in the way of the Autobahn. Of course, I.G. Farben welcomed Hitler. He gave their poison factory the aura of a philosophy. Nationalism. A state of mind in which you do not love your own country so much as you hate somebody else's nationalism. Under its aegis, morality decays. Ancient customs die out. Men are uprooted. The steadfast derided. The thoughtful branded. The rivers poisoned and the forests destroyed. Today, on my way home from Villach, I stopped at the quarry, shimmering in the autumn sun. A sand viper about to take its midday siesta had just crawled into the protective shadow of the rocks, and I looked at it for a long time, and it looked back at me through those weird and knowledgeable and mutely mournful eyes. There's a legend at home that these reptiles were created out of the old and ever-renewed earth to suck up all the acids and the poisons that ooze out of the deeds resulting from human cruelty and out of all our sins. June 22nd, 1941. Germany invades Russia. I had a spurious connection inside the German embassy in Moscow, and I knew, therefore, what had to come, what now has come. Never did a people tumble more helplessly, more stupidly into catastrophe. The stupid and arrogant view of the Russians as Hottentots is the first mistake. The second is the incredible underestimation of the distances involved, but worst of all is the underestimation of the strange Slavic soul only now beginning to be awake and still haunted by awful nightmares. With this war, we arrive for the first time at that moment in history when the Slavic world confronts the West. Yesterday, at the dawn of a burning hot day, I turned the knob on my radio and heard Herr Goebbels declare war against yesterday's allies. I turned away, deeply affected. It is entirely possible that this war now beginning will engulf me, my worldly goods, my physical life, and my children as well, and yet my first reaction was one of wild jubilation. In their immense vanity, Satan's own have overreached themselves, and they are in the net, and they will never free themselves again. And my heart rejoices. This is the fact. My heart rejoices at it. I hate you as the perverter of men's souls and the spoiler of their lives, and I hate you as the sworn enemy of the laughter of men. In every one of your speeches you make a mockery of the spirit which you have now silenced, and you forget that the private thought, the thought born out of sorrow and loneliness, can be far more deadly than all your implements of torture. You threaten all those who oppose you with death, but you forget that our hatred is a deadly poison. It will creep into your blood and we will die, shouting with joy as our hatred pulls you down with us into the depths. There's nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. It is not, nor it cannot come to good, says Hamlet. Well, no good can come out of this cloud of victories with the stink of crime. No good to a country whose foundation was based on propaganda and treason. No good to a people who pharisaically and self-righteously shift the burden of their own sins onto their own ancient symbols, takes its oath to criminals, and is prepared to take any oath and make its contract with Satan. No. The devil's price just goes up and up. Thoughts. After reading Heine on Germany, Christianity tempered somewhat the brutality of the Germanic delight in war, but if the day comes when that moderating symbol, the cross, loses its power, the relentless and brutal rage of which the Nordic poets write will break loose again. The old stone gods will rise up out of the ruin and rub the dust of 1,000 years out of their eyes. And Thor will spring forth and, raising his mighty hammer, will smash into nothingness the Gothic cathedrals. Clay is dying. Oh, we know. It's as though all the light has gone out of the world. As though our lives are an ebbing tide that recedes, and you do not know if the tide will ever come back again. As though the sun has grown smaller. As though one by one the stars go out. I watched the first Munich bombing from a hotel room in Aldotting, 60 miles to the east. A red glare transformed the autumn night and its full moon. In the distance, muffled booms. It was calculated to have taken 3 minutes for the sound to carry 3 minutes, and the victims at the scene were gasping and gagging and dying. The whole of the sky to the west was a sheet of flame. I was talking with a friend yesterday about the changing forms of man's cruelty, with particular reference to the horror that the Eastern Front has become. He's just come back. He witnessed the massacre at Kiev, where 30,000 Jews were slaughtered in a day, in the space of an hour perhaps. And when the machine gun bullets ran out, flamethrowers were used. Spectators rushed to the event from all over the city, off-duty troops, young fellows with the milk complexion of the young. Oh, degradation, oh, life without honor. Oh, thin shell that separates us from the souls in whom Satan burns. You judge us and find us wanting. And we here suffer in loneliness and dread. You point at us and at our lack of resistance. And we know that those who have resisted have died unknown in filthy bunkers, that the blood of martyrs has been spilled to no purpose, and that deeds have been done and never heard of. And still we lie here in the darkness, and we suffer as you never shall suffer. No, not on your deathbed. Beware the man who would make light of our suffering. Recently, on a walk in the frozen woods, I found a starving fawn that had been torn by a dog. I took it home, fatally wounded as it was, but it died in my arms, its eyes filled with tears, a look of endless suffering, an indictment of its creator for allowing one of its creatures to suffer so.